At precisely sunrise, while most of Britain still slept beneath a grey London sky, King Charles III reportedly signed an emergency decree inside a sealed palace chamber, and according to stunned insiders, the words attached to that document carried a chilling finality: "There is no coming back." What began as whispers of an overnight royal crisis has now erupted into a constitutional storm involving William, Anne, and a decision many inside the monarchy allegedly feared for months. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The first reports did not arrive as an official announcement. They came quietly, almost fearfully, through the kind of palace whispers that usually vanish before reaching the public. An emergency pre-dawn meeting had allegedly taken place at Buckingham Palace, and this was no ordinary discussion over schedules, charities, or ceremonial duties. According to insiders, King Charles had been awakened before sunrise for urgent legal review. The kind of review that only happens when the Crown believes delay could become dangerous. What made the moment even more explosive was the reported presence of Princess Anne and Prince William. Anne, long seen as the monarchy's iron guardian, was said to have entered the discussions with a firmness that left little room for emotion. William, meanwhile, allegedly carried the weight of the future on his shoulders, knowing that whatever was being decided would not simply affect one family dispute, but the direction of the crown itself. At the center of it all was a sealed red document folder described by palace insiders as extraordinary. Not routine, not ceremonial, extraordinary. That single word sent tremors through royal circles, because in the language of the palace, extraordinary usually means something has gone badly wrong behind closed doors. Before dawn had fully broken, aides were reportedly moving rapidly between offices, messages were being restricted, and certain security procedures were quietly altered. Nothing was said publicly, yet the silence only made the atmosphere heavier. Those familiar with palace operations claimed the mood had become cold, tense, and irreversible, as though every person inside understood they were witnessing a line being crossed. Then came the most damaging rumor of all: the decree had allegedly targeted a senior royal figure directly. No confirmation, no public name, but enough fear, enough urgency, and enough secrecy to suggest the palace was no longer managing a disagreement. It was containing a crisis, and perhaps that is why the phrase attached to the decree struck with such force. There is no coming back. Not a warning, not a threat, a verdict. For a monarchy built on patience, forgiveness, and survival, those words suggested that trust had finally reached its breaking point. But the decree itself was only part of the story, because behind that sunrise signature was a betrayal the palace had allegedly been trying to contain for weeks. Long before the emergency decree was signed, insiders claim Buckingham Palace had already descended into silent chaos. Meetings were cancelled. Trusted aides were locked out of sensitive discussions, and according to several palace administrative whispers, King Charles had become increasingly disturbed by reports crossing his desk, reports that threatened not only royal stability, but the future balance of power inside the House of Windsor itself. It did not begin with shouting. It began with absence. A private briefing removed from the calendar. A familiar aide told the matter was now above regular channels. A scheduled discussion quietly postponed without explanation. To the outside world, the palace remained calm, polished, and controlled. But behind that controlled silence, insiders suggest something far more serious was unfolding. Charles, already carrying the burden of a weakened reign and a family still bruised by years of public fracture, was reportedly reviewing confidential reports tied to an internal royal conflict. These were not ordinary complaints or passing disagreements. They were described by those familiar with the matter as the kind of documents that force a monarch to stop thinking like a father, a husband, or a wounded relative, and start thinking only as the guardian of the crown. That was where Princess Anne allegedly stepped in. Calm, severe, and unwilling to be distracted by emotion, Anne was described as leading a quiet containment operation before the crisis could break into public view. She had seen enough royal storms to understand one brutal truth: if the palace waits too long, the story escapes, the damage spreads, and the institution begins paying the price for private weakness. William, according to insiders, was equally firm. He reportedly warned that the situation could not continue, not as a dramatic statement, but as a sober recognition that the future king could no longer inherit unresolved chaos. For him, this was not simply about loyalty. It was about control, stability, and the terrifying possibility that one internal fracture could become a national spectacle. Staff were allegedly instructed not to discuss overnight developments with media contacts. Even trusted figures were kept at a distance. That alone raised alarm. In palace culture, silence is common, but total restriction is different. It suggests fear. It suggests urgency. It suggests that someone, somewhere, had triggered a response powerful enough to pull Charles, Anne, and William into the same private orbit. Soon, royal commentators began sensing the fracture. They did not have the full picture, but they had the pattern. Cancelled meetings, tightened access, unusual discretion, and a monarch reportedly growing more troubled by the hour. Comparisons quietly formed with earlier royal crises involving succession, loyalty, and the old painful question of whether blood should ever be allowed to outweigh duty. And then came the question no one inside the palace seemed ready to answer publicly. Who triggered the emergency response? Because decrees do not appear from nowhere. Legal reviews do not begin before sunrise without cause. And a king does not move toward irreversible action unless something has already broken beyond easy repair. But as pressure mounted behind closed doors, another shocking detail reportedly emerged, one that transformed palace concern into outright panic. According to multiple royal insiders, the emergency decree was not born from a single disagreement, but from what some within palace circles allegedly viewed as an unforgivable breach of trust. Reports suggest private communications, confidential plans, and internal royal discussions may have been exposed at the worst possible moment, while the king was already physically weakened and politically vulnerable. For weeks, the palace had reportedly tried to treat the matter as an internal wound, something painful but containable, something that could be handled quietly before it reached the public air. But insiders claim the situation changed when confidential palace matters appeared to move beyond the walls where they belonged. It was not just the possibility of leaked details that alarmed senior figures. It was the timing. The crown was already under strain. Charles was managing illness, William was carrying more public weight, and Anne was watching the old machinery of duty begin to tighten around a family that had already endured years of open fracture. Sources claim Charles viewed the situation as deeply personal, not because he wanted revenge, but because the alleged breach struck at the one thing he could not afford to lose: trust. In royal life, trust is not sentimental. It is operational. It decides who enters the room, who sees the paper, who hears the private warnings before the public statements are shaped. Once that trust is broken, every conversation becomes a risk, every silence becomes suspicious, and every delay becomes dangerous. William allegedly understood this faster than anyone expected. Reports suggest he pushed for immediate intervention, warning that hesitation would only deepen the damage. To William, the issue was no longer about embarrassment or family discomfort. It was about the future king inheriting an institution weakened by secrets escaping at the wrong time. He had seen how one uncontrolled story could become a global storm. He knew the monarchy could survive criticism, but it could not survive looking divided, careless, or hostage to its own private betrayals. That was when Princess Anne reportedly invoked strict constitutional protocol. Her position, according to palace whispers, was brutal in its simplicity. The institution must come before the individual. Not because the individual did not matter, but because the crown belongs to something larger than hurt feelings, personal alliances, or private loyalty. Discussions allegedly centered around protecting the monarchy above every personal bond, and that idea changed the temperature in the room. Royal aides feared lasting reputational damage if the palace appeared weak. Some factions allegedly argued for caution, worried that a severe response could deepen the family fracture. Others believed caution had already failed. The old methods, silence, patience, soft pressure, had not stopped the crisis from spreading. By nightfall, emergency legal language was reportedly being drafted, sharpened, reviewed, and prepared for the king's approval before sunrise. And in those final hours, the palace seemed to understand that this was no longer a warning. It was a reckoning. The decree was becoming the line between past forgiveness and future enforcement, between private pain and public survival, between the family Charles wished he could protect and the crown he was sworn to defend. And once the final language was approved, the monarchy's oldest enforcers reportedly moved with breathtaking speed. As dawn broke across London, Princess Anne and Prince William allegedly began executing what insiders are now describing as a coordinated royal counteroffensive, one designed not for public spectacle, but for absolute institutional control. Behind palace gates, phones reportedly stopped ringing, permissions vanished, and long-standing privileges appeared to evaporate almost overnight. The first sign of the counteroffensive, according to palace whispers, was not a public statement. It was restriction, quiet, immediate, and unmistakable. Access that had once been taken for granted was allegedly reviewed without warning. Internal schedules were shifted. Familiar channels of communication were narrowed. The palace did not roar. It tightened. Princess Anne reportedly oversaw the enforcement measures tied to the decree with the same severe discipline that has defined her royal life for decades. To those who understand Anne's role inside the family, this was no surprise. She has never been known for emotional theater. She moves through crisis with the cold patience of someone who believes duty is not something to be debated, but something to be obeyed. And once the king's signature was secured, insiders claim Anne treated the decree not as a suggestion, but as an order that had to be carried out fully. William, meanwhile, was said to have coordinated directly with senior palace officials, ensuring the operation did not drift into confusion. His involvement reportedly gave the response its future-facing weight. Anne represented the old guard, the memory of Queen Elizabeth's strictest standards. William represented what comes next. Together, they formed a powerful message. This was not one generation correcting another. This was the crown defending itself across generations. Palace staff were allegedly instructed to follow new chain of command procedures, a phrase that sounds administrative until one understands what it means in royal life. It means old favors no longer work. Private influence no longer travels the same route. Informal access begins to close. People who once moved confidently through palace systems suddenly discover that the doors still exist, but the permissions behind them have changed. Reports of emergency legal consultations involving royal advisors only deepened the sense that this was bigger than internal discipline. The palace was not merely managing embarrassment. It was building a barrier. Every word mattered. Every instruction had to survive scrutiny. Every move had to appear lawful, controlled, and impossible to dismiss as personal revenge. Royal commentators soon began describing the operation as cold and surgical, and that phrase spread because it captured the mood perfectly. There was no visible chaos, no dramatic public explosion, only a ruthless quietness that reminded some insiders of Queen Elizabeth II's strictest protocol eras, when the institution knew how to act without explaining itself to anyone. Media insiders claim there was no hesitation once the order came. That may be the most revealing detail of all. Hesitation would have suggested doubt. Delay would have suggested weakness. But this response, if palace whispers are accurate, carried the force of a monarchy that had already decided the time for warnings was over. But while the palace moved quickly to contain the fallout, the emotional cost inside the royal family was reportedly becoming impossible to hide. For those closest to the king, the most haunting part of the entire ordeal was not the decree itself, but the expression reportedly seen on Charles's face after the signature was complete. Witnesses describe a monarch exhausted, emotionally burdened, and painfully aware that the decision unfolding before him could permanently alter the family he spent decades trying to hold together. The silence that followed the signature was said to be heavier than the decision itself. According to palace sources, Charles had struggled emotionally with the final approval, not because he failed to understand the danger, but because he understood it too well. He knew the decree was not just ink on paper. It was a signal that patience had run out, that trust had collapsed, and that the family he had tried to preserve through compromise was now being divided by the cold demands of duty. Those close to the situation described the atmosphere as somber and icy. That phrase matters, because it suggests a room where no one celebrated, no one treated the moment as victory, and no one pretended the consequences would be easy. The crown may have acted with force, but force did not erase grief. Behind the legal language was a father, a king, and a man who had spent much of his life waiting for the throne, only to discover that wearing the crown meant making choices that could wound those closest to him. Comparisons were quickly drawn to Queen Elizabeth II's final years of leadership, when personal affection was often forced to bow before institutional survival. Elizabeth understood that monarchy demands sacrifice from the very people it protects. Now Charles was facing that same brutal lesson. The difference was that his moment came while he was reportedly weakened, emotionally strained, and surrounded by a family still carrying the scars of earlier battles. William allegedly emphasized duty before personal loyalty, a phrase that reportedly landed with painful force. For William, the future could not be built on uncertainty. The monarchy he will one day inherit cannot function if private relationships are allowed to threaten public trust. His message was not cruel, but it was firm. The crown must be protected before sentiment is allowed back into the room. Anne reportedly went further, warning that hesitation would weaken the crown. In her view, delay would not look merciful. It would look frightened. And if the palace appeared frightened, every critic, every rival, and every restless faction would sense weakness. That warning allegedly pushed the final decision beyond debate. Still, royal insiders claim Charles feared irreversible consequences. That fear now hangs over the entire story. Is reconciliation still possible after a decree like this? Can family bonds survive when the institution has formally drawn a line? Or has the monarchy entered a colder chapter, where forgiveness may exist in private, but access, privilege, and trust never return? The palace's public silence has only fueled greater speculation. No denial, no explanation, no emotional reassurance, just stillness. And sometimes, in royal life, stillness speaks more loudly than any statement ever could. And yet, despite the emotional devastation surrounding the decision, insiders insist the monarchy believed there was simply no alternative left. Among all the rumors surrounding the Sunrise Decree, one phrase continues to echo louder than any other. According to multiple palace-connected whispers, After the final document was reviewed and approved, a devastating conclusion was quietly spoken inside the room. There is no coming back. 4 words. But insiders claim those words carried the weight of exile, finality, and the collapse of trust at the very center of royal power. The phrase reportedly did not spread because it was shouted. It spread because it was repeated in the careful, frightened way palace language moves when people understand they have heard something historic. One aide allegedly told another. A senior contact repeated it with disbelief. Then, by the time the first morning calls began, those 4 words had become the unofficial summary of the entire crisis. Not a policy, not a briefing line, a sentence that sounded like the door closing. Insiders suggest the decree marked something more severe than punishment. It was being read inside royal circles as a permanent institutional break, the kind of decision that changes how access is granted, how trust is measured, and how forgiveness is quietly separated from power. A person can be forgiven privately, palace watchers whispered, yet still never be allowed back into the center of the machine. That was the chilling meaning behind the phrase. The family might one day speak again, but the institution may never fully reopen. Royal commentators soon began describing the moment as historic and chilling, because it carried echoes of earlier royal exiles and constitutional crises. Moments when personal scandal became too dangerous for private handling. The House of Windsor has survived abdication, divorce, public grief, betrayal, and brutal media storms. But survival has always required one painful rule. When the crown feels threatened, the crown protects itself first. What shocked palace aides most, according to reports, was the speed of the decision. For weeks, there had allegedly been caution, hesitation, and attempts to contain the matter quietly. Then suddenly, everything moved. Legal language was finalized. Internal permissions shifted. Senior figures aligned. The old palace habit of waiting was replaced by a colder instinct. Act before the story acts for you. Speculation now grows over what consequences will follow publicly. Will there be a formal statement? A quiet removal from future engagements? A restructuring of private access? Or will the palace do what it has done in its most ruthless moments, say almost nothing, while allowing the consequences to speak through absence, exclusion, and silence? Media outlets, sensing the scale of the story, reportedly began preparing major royal emergency coverage. Public interest exploded precisely because Buckingham Palace gave so little away. Every unanswered question became fuel. Every silent hour made the decree feel larger, darker, more final. And that silence may be the palace's most powerful weapon. Because when words disappear from royal life, meaning does not vanish. It deepens, it hardens, it becomes fear, rumor, and expectation. And by the time Britain began to understand that something serious had happened before sunrise, the real machinery of consequence may already have been moving beyond public view. But the true shockwave had not yet reached the outside world, because the palace now faced the impossible task of controlling what happened next. By mid-morning, the atmosphere surrounding Buckingham Palace had reportedly transformed into something bordering on constitutional panic. News helicopters circled overhead. Crowds gathered behind barriers. Journalists scrambled for confirmation. And across Britain, millions began asking the same terrifying question. What exactly had King Charles signed at sunrise, and who was about to pay the price for it? Within hours, the silence that had protected the palace began working against it. The lack of explanation became its own announcement. Royal correspondents reportedly sensed that this was not a routine internal matter. Because every usual channel seemed blocked, every familiar source suddenly cautious, every sentence from palace-adjacent contacts carefully stripped of detail. That level of secrecy did not calm the public. It sharpened the fear. As speculation intensified, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, seeking answers that no official voice seemed willing to provide. Some believed the decree involved family discipline. Others suspected a deeper constitutional move. The uncertainty became the story, and with every passing hour, the question grew heavier. Had Charles acted as a father trying to control a private crisis, or as a monarch defending the institution from something far more dangerous? Palace officials reportedly refused direct comment, and that refusal only widened the storm. In royal life, silence can be strategy, but silence can also look like panic when the country senses something serious has happened. Constitutional experts began weighing possible implications, carefully noting that emergency royal action, even when private, can reshape access, duties, internal authority, and the balance of power around the throne. Comparisons were quickly drawn to some of the monarchy's darkest modern crises, not because the details were identical, but because the emotional pattern felt familiar. Secrecy, family fracture, public anxiety, and the crown forced to choose between personal loyalty and survival. The monarchy has always presented itself as steady, but its most dramatic moments often begin the same way behind closed doors, with a document, a decision, and a silence too heavy to ignore. William and Anne reportedly remained in emergency consultations as the public pressure increased. That detail, if true, revealed how serious the palace believed the situation had become. William was not simply observing. Anne was not merely advising. They were allegedly helping steer the response, tightening the institution around the king at the exact moment the world was trying to force answers from him. Public debate soon grew beyond the question of who had been targeted. It became a debate over loyalty, duty, and royal survival. Should family be protected even when trust is broken? Should the crown act quietly and ruthlessly if it believes the institution is at risk? And how far can a monarchy go before private discipline becomes public history? By late morning, one thing seemed clear to those watching closely: the palace was not trying to explain the decree. It was trying to survive the shockwave it had unleashed, and somewhere behind that silence, the consequences were already beginning to take shape. And as Britain searched desperately for answers, insiders claimed the monarchy had already entered a new era from which there may be no return. As the sun finally rose fully above Buckingham Palace, one truth reportedly became impossible for even the palace's most loyal defenders to deny: the monarchy had changed overnight. The emergency decree was no longer simply a private royal matter, it had become the opening chapter of a new royal order, one built not on forgiveness, but on survival. And according to those closest to the institution, the crown had made its choice. Insiders claim the monarchy is now entering a new phase of enforcement, a colder and more disciplined chapter where private emotion is no longer allowed to slow public protection. For years, the palace survived storms by absorbing them quietly, hoping time would soften anger, silence would bury scandal, and loyalty would somehow repair what pride had broken. But this decree suggested something different. It suggested that the old patience had limits, and those limits had finally been reached. Anne and William reportedly emerged from the crisis as central stabilizing figures, not because they sought power, but because the institution needed certainty. Anne represented discipline, the hard memory of royal duty, the voice that refuses to tremble when the crown is under pressure. William represented continuity, the future of the monarchy, and the painful understanding that a king in waiting cannot inherit a house still burning from inside. Charles, according to palace whispers, was left emotionally shattered but resolute. That contrast may define this entire ordeal. A wounded monarch forced to act, a father figure pulled between personal bonds and constitutional duty, a king who may have wanted peace but allegedly accepted that peace without trust is only delay. And delay in the world of monarchy can become disaster. Palace strategy now appears focused on protecting institutional legitimacy above all else. Royal commentators suggest public trust became the decisive factor, because the crown cannot survive merely by existing. It survives because people believe it still stands for stability, service, and restraint. If that belief is threatened from within, then even the most painful action can be framed as necessary. Comparisons are already being drawn to historic moments of royal restructuring, when the monarchy chose survival over sentiment and allowed silence to do what statements could not. Yet questions remain. Can reconciliation ever happen after a decree carrying this level of finality? Can private forgiveness exist alongside permanent institutional exclusion? Or has the House of Windsor crossed into a new reality where duty, survival, and legacy now outweigh every personal bond? That is the haunting force of this story. The decree may have been signed at sunrise, but its shadow stretches far beyond one morning. It reaches into the future William must inherit, the legacy Charles must protect, and the iron standard Anne allegedly refused to let collapse. The crown did not simply respond. It warned every person near its center that loyalty is no longer assumed, access is no longer guaranteed, and betrayal may carry consequences that even time cannot undo. Because in the House of Windsor, insiders whisper that forgiveness may fade with time, but once trust is broken at the highest level of the crown, history rarely offers a second chance. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.